Hi there and welcome to this Rebecca Page sewing tutorial. My name is Zoe and today we'll be sewing the Madison Blouse. The Madison Blouse pattern is a PDF pattern available via the Rebecca Page website. It comes in children's sizes, newborn to 12 years, and ladies sizes extra small to 5XL. Once you've downloaded your Madison Blouse pattern, read the sewing tutorial beginning to end and print off your pattern pieces. Then you'll need to cut out your fabric, and you should have a similar array of pieces as to what I have here. Make sure when you're tracing out your pattern pieces that you transfer all markings onto your fabric and iron on your interfacing at this point as well. Your first step is to now stay stitch your front and back yokes. We'll just need to use a normal stitch length and start from the very edge of one of your front yokes here, and so you can see this point here, and so we start down the bottom here and we just stitch all the way around up to the top neckline here. So I'm keeping to a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance because the actual seam allowance for this pattern is a 1/2 inch, and as we don't want to see this stitching, we need to keep in less than the 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm not stay stitching at the end, as this is a stitch that will be hidden once we've sewn our blouse, and you just need to repeat this for your second yoke, again starting from the bottom here, coming up to the neck where it will be the neckline, so upwards, and then repeat for your back yoke also. But with the back yoke you will need to start from the center of your back yoke and stitch around to the shoulder, where the shoulder seam will be here, and then again start from the center and come around and stitch up to the shoulder seam again. Our next order of business is now to make gathering stitches on our front blouse panels, and you should have marked your pattern pieces as you were cutting them out, and you'll need to gather between the notches on the mark lines that you placed on your fabric piece. So we'll just gather between those lines. You may like to put in 2 rows of gathering stitches. With poplin I find I can get away with just 1 line of gathering stitching. But if you're using quilting cotton or a heavier fabric, you may need to put in the traditional 2 rows of stitching. Now you'll just need to increase your stitch length and loosen your tension. Put in a stay stitch at the beginning. And be careful not to overstep that 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you can already see, just with that 1 row of gathering stitches, the piece of fabric has already started to gather all on its own. Then you will need to take your yoke piece, and this is our matching one, you can see on the angles, and then we will just pin our top yoke down. Now you will need to allow for a 1/2 inch overhang here of your front yoke here, because when you put in that row of stitching at the 1/2 inch seam allowance, it will actually match up, and if you put the pieces on matching corner to corner, you will find that you have overhang. So I'm just going to pop a pin in, and then I'm going to gather this row of stitching here so it matches up to our front yoke panel. Sorry, just my apologies, my hand's in the way. And so I've just pulled that, and then we want to make sure there is an overhang 1/2 inch on our front panel here. So 1/2 inch overhang with our front yoke piece on top, and then 1/2 inch overhang for our bottom blouse panel, front panel there. I'll just put a pin in. Make sure your gathers are nice and even along your notches there. If it's all bunched up in the middle, it tends to look a bit odd. Now, it's important here to use that 1/2 inch seam allowance because we're going to do a special flat felled seam to hide all our stitching on the inside. If you are using a serger or overlocker, then you just need to make sure you keep to that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and obviously remove some of that bulk as you're sewing with your serger. But I will be showing you all the traditional ways to sew this blouse today, but just follow the written tutorial for your serger instructions. So we're just going to pop in a stay stitch at the beginning. Make sure you adjust your machine back to normal tension and normal stitch length. I'm just stay stitching at the beginning and end of this stitch, and now it's all sewn. Now we don't want to cut that seam allowance. Now we'll remove our gathering stitches, and I will show you how to do the flat felled seam next. Once you have sewn your front yoke to your side blouse piece, you'll just need to remove your gathering stitches in your gathers here, which I've already done, and then we just need to press that seam allowance upwards like so, and this is the beginning of our flat felled seam, and all our stitching will be completely hidden inside, and it makes for a beautiful finish. Now this bit is rather particular. You will need to remove your seam allowance from your top yoke by at least half along here, but do not cut your front blouse seam allowance. So do not cut the piece that had the gathers in it. We just remove the seam allowance from that top yoke only. It's very important. So I've just reduced the seam allowance in half approximately, and then what we are going to do is we are going to tuck the seam allowance over that overhang, and so it is all enclosed. So I'm just going to put some pins in just to hold it and then press. So I'm going to use my small pins with no plastic so that I can iron directly over them. Just be careful when you iron your pins, they will be extremely hot for a few moments. So I'm just folding it over. Now this part is tricky as it's not a traditional flat felled seam allowance, it's a little bit narrower, so it is a little bit of a fiddly job. So just take your time. Alright, once it's all pinned down, I'm just going to press that. Oh, tuck that a little bit in there. Oh, watch out for those hot pins. And then we are going to just stitch along, right along that top edge of our lovely folded flat felled seam. So you will see the stitching on the outside of your blouse, so coordinate your bobbin thread or use a contrast if you prefer. Now we're going to stitch our front pieces right along our pressed seam allowance here on our flat felled seam, and we're just going to go right along the very edge as close as we can, and if you can try and keep it nice and straight and even, as you will see this stitching from the right side of the garment, that is ideal. And just go carefully. And there we have our first front flat felled seam. And you'll just need to repeat this whole process with your opposite front side piece, and then we will do the back, very much the same as the front.